It's a pivotal moment, a dreadful moment. We're by no means out of that moment, and we just don't know how bad can be. But what lies ahead, I think, is something we all need to be very, very concerned about, because it could get a lot worse.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States by speaking today with Alvin Rosenfeld, one of the world's leading scholars on the subject of anti-Semitism. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. How is it that a generation of Holocaust education and programs did nothing to prevent the current surge of anti-Semitism in the United States? That's a question that Jewish groups and all those who have done so much to promote not just the preservation of the memory of the Shoah, but also to help ensure that the oft-repeated pledges of never again can be upheld. It would seem that it has succeeded in doing the former, as despite the persistence of Holocaust deniers, the memorialization of it has become ubiquitous. But it has failed at the latter. That's not just because Western nations have consistently refused to act to prevent other acts of genocide, such as those in Rwanda or today in Western China of the Uyghurs, but also because anti-Semitism has not just survived on the margins of society, but has become part of mainstream discourse. The emphasis on an effort to see all forms of prejudice as a precursor to the Holocaust manifestly failed to inoculate the generation of Americans who grew up during an era of Holocaust education against anti-Semitism, or to teach them that it is not ordinary prejudice, but an idea that is always connected to political movements. Thus, despite more people knowing about Auschwitz or hearing about the 6 million, it hasn't prevented a generation of Americans who have been educated in schools where they were indoctrinated in woke ideology from understanding that viewing Jews and Israelis as white oppressors, regardless of the facts about the conflict with the Palestinians, essentially dehumanizes them in the same way that Nazi concepts did in the last century. Those who wish to separate discussions of anti-Semitism from the war that is being waged by Islamists and neo-Marxists against the Jewish state and the right of Jews to self-determination in their ancient homeland, as well as their right to self-defense against genocidal movements like Hamas, aren't just wrong-headed. They are creating a safe space for Jew hatred on the streets of American cities, college campuses, and even the editorial pages of newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. The history of the Holocaust may be remembered and studied, but in an era when new forces have arisen threatening to carry out new mass slaughters of Jews, those who profess to care about anti-Semitism must understand that if you aren't willing to stand up for the right of Jews to defend their state and their lives against Islamist murderers, rapists, and kidnappers, then they shouldn't waste our time with fake mourning for the Jews killed 80 years ago in the Holocaust. To discuss all this, we're honored to have with us today one of the most respected scholars and thinkers about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Alvin Rosenfeld is professor of English and Jewish Studies at Indiana University and has taught there since 1968. He holds the Irving M. Glazer Chair in Jewish Studies and is director of the university's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. He founded Indiana's Bourne's Jewish Studies program and served as its director for 30 years. He is the author of numerous books, studies, and articles on the subject of anti-Semitism, including the 1979 Confronting the Holocaust, The Impact of Elie Wiesel, the 1980 A Double Dying, Reflections on Holocaust Literature, the 1997 Thinking About the Holocaust After a Half Century, the 2009 The Writer Uprooted, Contemporary Jewish Exile Literature, and the 2011 The End of the Holocaust. Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, welcome to Top Story.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by going straight to a discussion of October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism that we've seen in this country in the aftermath of that horrendous attack on Israel. It's been a shock to a lot of American Jews. Do you think October 7th represents a true turning point or reflects a change in attitudes towards Jews in Israel? Or is this just the moment when more people are realizing what has happened to our culture?
I think it does represent a turning point, and a serious turning point. In fact, we all know anti-Semitism has been on the upsurge since around the turn of the millennium, for a number of reasons I won't bother to unpack right now. So it's not altogether surprising that we're seeing it escalate, but the degree to which it's escalating, the rapidity with which it's escalating, it's more vocal, it's more visual, it's more in your face, it's more unapologetic than any of us, I believe, expected. I spend a lot of my time, too much of my time, tracking Jew hatred in various forms. I'm not in the least surprised that Israel hatred and Jew hatred coalesce as intimately and as ferociously as they do. But my gosh, October 7th put exclamation points behind all of that. So yes, it's a pivotal moment, a dreadful moment. We're by no means out of that moment, and we just don't know how bad can be. But what lies ahead, I think, is something we all need to be very, very concerned about, because it could get a lot worse.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think it is a turning point. And while anti-Semitism is nothing new in America, I think the mainstreaming of it has become more apparent since October 7th. And I guess the question is, do critical, agree, at least with me, that's my point, that the critical factor in this is the rise of critical race theory, intersectionality, the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which defines Jews and Israel as white oppressors and therefore grants a permission slip to anti-Semitism. Do you see that as, what has really changed the equation since the millennium, as you referred to it?
I think everything you just said, Jonathan, is unfortunately right on the money. Anti-Semitism is deeply embedded within our culture. I'm speaking to you from a university town. As you know, I teach at Indiana University. It's not as bad here as at many campuses, but it's worse than it has been. And one can't be surprised at that, given, in fact, certain ideological corruptions that have set into universities over a long period of time. You just named some of the main ones. As we both know, Rabbi Wolpe was on the Harvard task force to study anti-Semitism. He removed himself from that task force pretty quickly once he saw it probably wouldn't, in fact, be effective. And one of the things that he said that sticks to mind is that what we have before us is a great period of unlearning. As a professor over many years, I devote myself to helping my students learn, I've never before thought that I have to now begin teaching them to unlearn. But Rabbi Wolpe's phrase is apt, and I'm not quite sure what we need to do to follow it out successfully. If we can, though, it's not going to be an instant remedy whatsoever. It's going to take a long time, and I keep the if in place because it's not clear that those people invested in the very ideological currents that you just named would be willing to even acknowledge the influence of all of that stuff on the hostility we face, let alone set about taking it apart and helping people unlearn it.
Well, that's an excellent point, and obviously, that doesn't just refer to the point that there is a whole industry of DEI employees. There are legions of DEI administrators, woke commissars, as I like to call them, at every school in America and in every arts organization, and spreading into corporate America and now even the government, since President Biden's executive order is implementing DEI throughout every government agency and department. So, yeah, there are a lot of people with livings, at stake here, but it's also a question of power, because sort of the long march of the progressives that, basically conquered academia in taking ideas that perhaps when you started out as a young educator, as a young professor, these ideas were very marginal. Today, they're not only not marginal, they're the new orthodoxy. And I guess the question I'm often asked is, how did that happen?
Yeah, I ask myself the same question because now it's deeply entrenched and it causes no end of problems. That's true. I think it happened in part because, unfortunately, in America, a lot of Americans feel a kind of white guilt. We both know America has a long and shameful history of racism, which is not to say that it's systemic and that each and every American is, in fact, a racist. I reject that out of hand. At the same time, a lot of people seem to have been convinced that they are racist. And the terms that are used today, you just mentioned some of them, white oppressors and
white privilege.
I've never in my life regarded myself in those terms. These are not descriptive terms, these are accusatory terms. And if one gives in to the accusation, it's gone. And too many people have given in to it, have been unwilling to challenge it. Now, I am seeing a good deal of pushback now against DEI. I hope it succeeds, because a great deal of harm has been caused by the very things that we're talking about. Jews in particular have been set back quite a bit by DEI. I've read polls that say the numbers of Jewish students these days in elite universities are about half of what they had been some years ago, not because Jewish students are any less bright than they always have been, or that they don't want to get into the major universities, but when you have preferential treatment for admissions, for hiring, certain groups are going to be preferred, and other groups, if you're not among the preferred, are going to be set back, even if there was not the intention necessarily to set you back, but it's a built-in ramification and a very damaging one.
Yeah, well, I think it's clear to me that this woke ideology has anti-Semitism baked into it. That it's in because of its sort of neo-Marxist origins, and because it divides the world into two immutable groups, perpetually at war, white oppressors and people of color who are victims, and kind of doesn't matter what either group are doing or the circumstances. One is good, one is bad. I guess the question is, and this is something that is being debated particularly in the Jewish world, is, can DEI be reformed to be more favorable to Jews? That seems to be the position of the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee. It was certainly the position of a group of Hollywood actors and filmmakers who wanted the new diversity rules for the Oscars that will be implemented next year to include Jews along with other approved minorities, and were complaining that Jews were being erased and it's anti-Semitic. I don't think DEI can be reformed. I think it's bad for America. I think the trouble with those diversity rules is not that they don't include Jews, is that they exist at all. But do you think that there is an argument that this ideology can be ameliorated to at least be more friendly to Jews, if not to anybody else?
As we both know, Jonathan, there is no such thing as a unified Jewish community in America. I wish there were, but there's not. And there never really has been, but the disunity today, I think, is sharper and more serious than we've seen it for quite a while. There are Jews who say, no, we should not oppose DEI. We should make sure Jews are included within it. And then there are Jews who say, as you just said, that the entire enterprise is corrupt. Whenever you set aside merit as a distinguishing factor in admissions and recruitment and everything else, you're not talking American anymore. You're talking about, Natan Sharansky has an introduction to Ed Bernstein's book on wokeism, as you know. And he said it's all familiar to him. He grew up in the Soviet Union, where in fact such standards, if standards is the right word, were in place. And it handicapped not only a great many individuals, but the society as such. So yes, what you're focusing on now is very serious. It's deeply entrenched. It will not go away easily or quickly. The question then is, can it be reformed? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not optimistic that it can be.
Do you think, and obviously this is something you've witnessed throughout your career, it has, sort of the long march of the progressives have taken these ideas and, as I said, not merely made them mainstream, but they're the orthodoxy in academia today. Do you think they can be reversed? Whether it was by government fiat, obviously some states are trying to ban it. The number of academics who oppose it is very small, but they're not necessarily defensible to the general population. I think a question that is on the tip of everyone's tongue since October 7th, and we've seen this, outbreak of anti-Semitism and the links to DEI and that mindset becoming very clear, is, can it be reversed? Are you an optimist or a pessimist about that?
By nature, I'm not a pessimist. I am a realist, however. And reversing it would take a huge, huge effort. There would be a lot of opposition to it. There already is a lot of opposition to it. Nonetheless, I am seeing far more pushback these days than I have in the past. Certain states, as we both know, have actually defunded DEI programs. I expect there may be some more of those. Then there's pushback against the pushback, and we're all for freedom of speech and academic freedom. I wouldn't stay in university life if I didn't have freedom of speech. But at the same time, I'm fully aware, and everyone needs to be aware, that it can be abused. And it can be applied very selectively. I have no doubt whatsoever, if the kind of anti-Semitism we're seeing on a number of campuses these days was not anti-Semitism, but anti-black prejudice, anti-gay prejudice, that stuff would be shut down in 5 minutes, and people who are strong defenders of free speech would go mute.
I think that was the point about the famous, the viral video of the 3 college presidents testifying before Congress, when they were sort of parsing their words very carefully so as not to, not to put themselves against what they considered to be free speech. When they were asked, is advocacy of genocide of Jews against your rules? And they answered, it depends on the context. I think we all know if people were advocating for lynching of African Americans, God forbid, there would be no possible context in which that would be allowed. And, any student who did such a thing would be expelled, and any professor, whether they had tenure or not, they'd find a way to fire them.
Right. But it is what it is. It's very nasty business, and it causes a great deal of harm, no question about it. My campus, I'm proud to say, at least to date, has never had Israel Apartheid Week. We haven't had BDS on this campus, unlike many of the more elite campuses. But there are groups now planning to do those things this very spring. We'll see what happens. But all of it is done in bad faith. None of it is done for the sake of Palestinians. It's all anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. And the only thing we need to do is continue to be very vocal and very strong in opposing it. It must not prevail.
Let's drill down for a moment into the question of what is and what isn't anti-Semitism. I think one of the debates, certainly within the Jewish community in recent years, has been, how do you define anti-Semitism? And the generally accepted definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, the IHRA, includes demonization of Israel, calling Israelis Nazis, and more or less declares anti-Zionism to be anti-Semitism in most contexts. That's opposed by people on the left who put forward their own definition, the so-called nexus definition, which basically carves out a permission slip for anti-Zionism and demonization of Israel. Where do you come down on the question of how do you define anti-Semitism?
I'm supportive of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism as just that, a working definition. It's not a legally binding document, but it's a very useful document, most especially in the 11 points that follow the definition itself, numbers of which, in fact, are directed against Israel haters of one kind or another. So to call Israel a Nazi state, for instance, or to call Israel an apartheid state, is not, in fact, criticism of Israel, it's defamation of Israel. There's only one Jewish state in the world. 47% of world Jewry reside in that state. There's no Jewish future worthy the name, I'm absolutely convinced, without the state of Israel. And I think a lot of people who go against Israel either simply don't know the facts or they don't care about the facts. They believe that Israel really doesn't deserve a future, and many of them believe it never should have been created in the first place. And their aim is to help liquidate the only Jewish state there is. That has to be strongly opposed. I and others who study anti-Semitism make no bones about it. Certain things you can't really argue the nuances of, because there are no nuances in these respects.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are going to deny to Jews rights that you don't deny to anybody else, I mean, and which is more or less what anti-Zionism is about. It's denying Jews the right to a homeland, the right to self-defense. That, there's no international movement to abolish any other state on the planet. I think by definition, that's discrimination, and discrimination against Jews is anti-Semitism.
Yes, we agree.
Let's turn for a moment to the study of the Holocaust and how this plays a role in our current discussions. I think inappropriate Holocaust analogies are a bane of American politics and discourse on both the left and the right. But is October 7th finally a moment when such an analogy might be applicable? I mean, that's something that I think some who work in Holocaust scholarship, I think particularly some of the people associated with Yad Vashem in Israel, have resisted. Are they right, or should we? Is it okay to analogize what actually is the largest mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust to the Holocaust?
Right. It's going to take us a while to think through everything that occurred on October 7th. What happened on October 7th was not war, as we typically think about war. People use the word pogrom, but unless you really are a scholar of Jewish history and know about Kishinev and Khmelnytsky and other kinds of really brutal, barbaric, savage attacks against Jews, the word pogrom probably doesn't resonate with the kind of force that we wish it would. So to date...
Yeah, I think a lot of people think it's just breaking the wedding gifts in the second act of Fiddler on the Roof.
Well, yeah, well, if only that's what it were.
Right.
So what occurred, and the more we learn about October 7th, the worse it gets. What those people did to the Jews living, in fact, in those southern towns and kibbutzim far exceeds even the excesses of war. Some of those people who came across the border have been captured. They've been interrogated. I remember listening to a synopsis of one of those interrogations, and the guy said, "We were told, dirty them, whore them." That's not war. We use words like degradation, atrocity, terrorism. They're all applicable. They don't even begin to resonate with the truth of what happened to those poor women and men and children and grandparents on that day, which leads me, in fact, to think that although the numbers don't begin to resemble the numbers of the Holocaust, thank God for that, the brutality, the atrocity, the bestial behavior. You know, I've read and read, as no doubt you have, about the only thing I've not yet found, and I hope I don't find, is cannibalism. But short of cannibalism, Jonathan, what occurred on October 7th resembles the worst that we've been through.
Right. Yeah, it's unspeakable, and it's hard for people to look at it, those who've seen the films, and, you know, a lot of people just don't want to see the evidence because it is too horrible.
But here's a comparison and an analogy. As we both know, we've lived for a long time with Holocaust distortion, Holocaust denial, Holocaust diminishment. We're now seeing October 7th denial, diminishment, distortion, and the like. In that respect, the analogy is clear.
Yeah, I mean, although it's somewhat ironic because the Nazis really did try to cover up. They did not broadcast their final solution, or, you know, it was something that had to be uncovered, and something that they did actually try to cover up, as they certainly retreated from Eastern Europe in the last year of World War II. Whereas, you know, Hamas broadcasted, they posted it on social media, and we have this, you know, bizarre, you know, phenomenon where Israel haters are, at the one hand, glorying in the atrocities of October 7th, and at the same time denying them, which I guess is a difference from the Holocaust. You know, the as you were detailing a moment ago, the kind of bestiality, you know, everything short of cannibalism, it is redolent of some of the worst of the Holocaust. But this kind of idea that you could film it with GoPro cameras and then deny it, that's something a little different.
Yeah, and that was, of course, intentional. It was meant to be exhibitionist. It was meant to be performative. It was meant to show Israelis and Jews especially, but the world as such, that they're going to do whatever they're going to do without inhibition, without restraint, without apology. What's been missing in so much of the commentary about Hamas, you and I both know, is the Hamas Charter, and everything behind the Hamas Charter. It's impossible to understand Hamas without understanding a very radical version of Islam, which stands for jihad, which quotes the Quran in order to validate the annihilation of the Jewish people. I've seen some references to that. I wrote a small piece of my own about it, which appeared in Sapir. Others have said some things. The American public at large is not clued into that. Without being clued into that, we simply cannot understand Hamas and groups like Hamas.
Yeah, I think people don't want to understand it. They
Well, then we're in
prefer.
very, very bad shape.
Yeah, I think so. We see these support literally. The people not. It's not just that they don't connect the fact that if they're calling for a ceasefire, they're basically saying that Hamas should survive and be able to go on and carry out its pledges to do more October 7th. They don't really. The New York Times had a feature just the day before yesterday about Black pastors rallying to support of the Palestinians, seeing them as a fellow oppressed people, without connecting it to what the goals of that other oppressed people were.
Well, without understanding the goal and the future goals, in fact, we don't stand a chance. If I may introduce something we've not yet talked about, in Friday's New York Times, which I read on a plane to New York, I'm now back in Bloomington, there was a full-page ad by Jewish Voice for Peace, underwritten by rabbis who were members of the Rabbinic Council of Jewish Voice for Peace. They hammered away at Israel in terms of the rhetoric of genocide. The word was repeated multiple times. And at one point, speaking as rabbis, they turned to President Biden, and this is a direct quote, "President Biden, by supporting Israel, you have chosen death." Why it's in the Jewish interest in this country for rabbis to address the President of the United States, whatever one may think about him with regard to Israel in different respects, and say, "You have chosen death," and those of us who are accusing you of choosing death are rabbis, is a disgrace for the Jewish people. They're not my rabbis, that's for sure, and I wish the people who were my rabbis would also shell out $50,000, which is what a page like that costs in the New York Times, and put out a counter statement in the name of rabbis against that kind of thing. So there's also, sorry to say, but truth to say, there is an enemy within. And that's just one exhibit of the enemy within.
Yeah, well, I would counter when it comes to Jewish Voice for Peace and its fellow travelers, if not now, they are guilty of spreading anti-Semitic blood libels. Their so-called deadly exchange talking point, where they have concocted this theory, in which they came up with after the riots in Ferguson, Missouri, 2014, which was sort of the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. They came up with this idea that American first responders who received training in Israel were being trained to track down and kill blacks in the streets of American cities. And these so-called Jewish groups have promoted this idea. And as far as I'm concerned, this is an anti-Semitic trope, and it shows the connection between sort of woke ideology, which is at the heart of sort of the BLM mindset, and anti-Semitism. There's a straight line.
If I may say the following, 18 or 19 years ago, I published an article called "Progressive Jewish Thought and the New Anti-Semitism." I was slaughtered for writing that article, but what I wanted to show way back when, before wokeism even was heard about, is that there are Jewish enablers of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Now it's in full blossom. At the time I wrote, I could look at individuals, but not yet movements. I was attacked roundly for about 2 years. I have no regrets whatsoever that I wrote that article. It needed to be said. In some ways, it was a breakthrough. I wish, looking back, I had been wrong. Looking back, in fact, I see I was right.
Yeah, well, I think there's no question that you were right. Well, let me change, tack a little bit different subject. As we survey the explosion of anti-Semitism, which we've already discussed in our society now, is it fair to ask whether the great expansion in the amount of Holocaust education that has taken place in this country in the last 30, 40 years, has it failed? And if it did, was it because of the kind of Holocaust education employed, or is it just mistaken? Was it a mistake to think that as much as it is important to, cherish and to, memorialize, the Shoah, that highlighting Jewish suffering would do anything other than to encourage anti-Semites to think, replace the Shoah? I would think of it as now a metaphor for anything that's bad.
You're speaking to a Holocaust educator himself.
I am.
Tomorrow, in fact, I'll be back in the classroom. I've been teaching Primo Levi, whom I know personally, following earlier teaching Elie Wiesel. Then we're going on to a number of other important writers. I stand absolutely behind the value of introducing students, in fact, to that history, in my case through literary texts for the most part. Most of my students are not Jewish. They know from day one the course will be very demanding emotionally as well as intellectually. Almost no students drop out. They take it seriously. They learn a lot. I hear from time to time from former students whose names have been forgotten. Professor Rosenfeld, I studied with you 35 years ago, and I want you to know that what I learned in your courses on the Holocaust changed my life and changed their lives for the better. So everything depends on who's teaching, how one is teaching. One of the things, though, I realize was mistaken, not willfully mistaken, but there was the built-in notion that knowledge of the Holocaust would somehow be prophylactic, that if people really knew how horrible Jews had been treated in the past, slaughtered by the millions, persecuted before being slaughtered, etc., etc., it would never again enter the public sphere. We were simply wrong about that. The assumption, an understandable one, ended up not being valid. I mentioned I had been a friend of Primo Levi. I was also been a long-term friend of Elie Wiesel, and I met with Elie shortly before he died, and he was forlorn. And I asked him, Elie, what's up? You really look pretty sad. And he turned to me and he said, Alvin, I failed. I said, what do you mean you failed? You probably did more than any other single individual to, in fact, fill people in on the Jewish experience in Nazi Germany. You didn't fail. You succeeded to a very large degree. He said, if I had succeeded, there would be no anti-Semitism today, and it's all coming back. Well, I did my best. I don't think I succeeded in trying to lift his spirits. He did not fail. But all of us who've done what we can do to keep the memory of all that horribleness alive were naive to believe it would prevent further anti-Semitism. The whole knowledge of the Holocaust is not a taboo against anti-Semitism.
I think that's well stated, and that's certainly true. Obviously, Holocaust education has value, but the notion that it was sort of the silver bullet that would kill anti-Semitism was false. Number one, because I think a lot of the some of the curricula, especially, there's a difference between, a serious course of, such as those that you teach and sort of the, much less rigorous, curricula that are implemented in high schools, that I think, it's promoted the people know about the Holocaust, but it's, to me, the explanation to why Holocaust analogies, which are almost always inappropriate, not always, but almost always, is that people know of it and it's just this really bad thing, and it becomes anybody I don't like is Hitler.
Yeah, well, the only thing I can say about that is scornful. It shouldn't be, and yet it is. Those analogies are wicked analogies, really, and they gut the history of the Holocaust, of whatever integrity it simply needs to have, by trivializing it, in fact.
Yeah. Well, I guess, one of the questions you referred to your long service and to, really you've taught generations at Indiana and through the, people who have read your books and your essays. Are you at all, and I guess it's relevant to what you said about Elie Wiesel and his self-evaluation. Are you at all frustrated about and because you've contributed enormously to our understanding of these issues, frustrated by the persistence of it, of Jew hatred and its ability to attach itself to different ideologies and, now to woke leftism? How much have we really advanced our comprehension of what we're up against? Is it, that's too much to ask of an academic to say, why didn't you change the world? Elie Wiesel didn't change the world. He certainly improved it, but he couldn't stop everything that was bad from going on. But having worked in this field for so long, is it wearying to now, after so many years, where we began this conversation by saying that it's probably the worst that it's ever been in America, certainly in our lifetimes?
It is wearying, it's depressing, it's disheartening, it's dispirited, but you're talking to a driven man. I'm in my 56th year on the faculty here. People ask me how I enjoy retirement. I say I never heard of the word. After I met with Elie, in fact, I established our Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism to try, in fact, overcome the very concerns that had worn him down. We just did a major conference in New York City at the Center for Jewish History. We brought together 20 scholars, but not to talk as scholars only to other scholars. It was a very, very important symposium to find this outreach to the broader community. The room at the center seats 250. We were almost full to capacity. Some 1,900 people have looked in online at what we did. We just have to keep doing everything and anything we can do to open people's eyes to the threats before us. The threats are very serious, and they're getting worse, and they're ongoing. I don't have any magic solution to put an end to it. We can't put an end to anti-Semitism. Can we curtail its worst excesses? Can we put some restraints on it? Hopefully, yes. That does require, however, educating people to what anti-Semitism is, where it's coming from, what drives it, who its major agents are, what ideologies, in fact, fuel it, and then see what we can do. Jonathan, both you and I, in fact, I think we're fellow Philadelphians, if I'm not mistaken.
I live in Philadelphia. I'm originally from New York.
Okay. Well, I'm originally from South Philadelphia, the most elite part of Philadelphia. I'm a first-generation American Jew. My parents were born in Podolia. And they raised us in America thinking, knowing, believing the country would be open to us so long as we were serious, decent people, worked hard, achieved something, and for most of their lifetimes they were right. However, We both know we're now living in an America in which every synagogue in the country, every Jewish school in the country, every Jewish community center in the country has security out front. That's not the America my parents knew, that you and I grew up in. It is today's America. And that's serious stuff. It can get worse. It has been getting worse. So what can we do? Shake people, open their eyes, get them to realize not that the good old days are gone forever, because even the good old days, as we know, in the 30s and 40s, were not entirely good. But what we're facing today has a great deal of energy, momentum, fury behind it. That's dangerous stuff.
Yeah, well, I think that's very true. For me, I think, the inflection point is, how do we feel about America? And you raise a very interesting point about, the America that your parents believed in, that you were raised to believe in. And I would say the same for me. I'm a great believer in American exceptionalism. And, it is not an accident that America became the freest, best, place of the diaspora in the history of the Jews. And I've always felt that as long as America remained very different, rooted in its own values and not like any other country, truly exceptional, that the Jews would be safe here. And that the instinct of many immigrants was to only see it as just another way station was wrong. But the point about woke ideology is that it's not just directed against Jews, it's directed against the entire conception of America, sort of the 1619 Project, which is tearing down the idea of 1776 and the arc of American liberty. When you destroy a belief in those basic American values and replace it with sort of this Marxist mindset, you destroy American exceptionalism, and by definition, you make it a worse place for Jews, and a sort of a validation of the line in the Haggadah, which is sort of the watchword of awareness about anti-Semitism. In every generation they rise against us.
Vehisha Amda, yes. You're right about that. I live and have lived now for many, many years in a different America than the America I grew up in, the Midwest. And a lot of people in the Midwest for sure don't buy into woke ideology. They are more traditional in holding on to, and I'm not talking about professors at the university, but just the people among whom we live. They're decent people.
You're in a very red state, yes.
Yep, it's true. And in this very red state, I'm happy to say that after October 7th, I received numbers of communications from non-Jewish people, including some ministers of local churches, expressing concern, expressing solidarity, expressing support. That's anti-woke, or never been woke, let's put it that way. So that American exceptionalism that you just mentioned, that I also subscribe to, in fact, is alive in certain parts of the country among certain people. It needs to grow, or at least return in larger numbers to its origins. But I'm not forlorn that it's lost forever. I do believe, however, it needs to be strenuously opposed.
Yes, well, I think that's very true, and a good point to close. Professor Rosenfeld, thanks so much for joining us today, for your great body of work on this subject and your insights that you shared with us. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I'll be in assignment in Israel next week, but we'll be back again with Top Story in 2 weeks. And so remember, Keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again soon.